Patrick Taran joins us now. He's president of the research organization Global Migration Policy Associates. Patrick, thanks so much for being with us. What regions are facing the biggest migration challenges at the moment? Which governments, which countries do you think are best handling it?
Well, I think it's important to jump a little bit above some of the trees and look at the forest out there. First of all, to take into consideration the fact that there are about nearly 300 million migrants around the world. Most of them are migrant workers at all skills levels. If you look at, for example, across the European region, about 25% of the entire workforces in European cities are made up of the foreign-born, migrants by definition. You look at the Western Hemisphere countries, especially the immigration countries, Canada, the US, also Australia and New Zealand. Again, 20 to 25% of the workforces are made up of what we're talking about as migrants. Let's just keep in mind that when we're looking at some of the specific situations you just portrayed, they're the refugees, primarily. They're people who've been forced to leave. And in the global total, refugees make up about less than, in fact, 10% of the global migration population. So if we come to your question, I think a number of Western countries have been handling well migration because they depend on it, and our economies depend on it. And even during the worst situation of the pandemic, what we saw happening in Switzerland, in other European countries, in Canada, and so on, is that migrant workers, seasonal workers, were exempted from the restrictions. Canada even sent planes to countries in the Caribbean to bring the seasonal workers that needed to be in Canada to make sure Canada had food in the latter part of 2020. Same with Switzerland, that sent buses to Romania and Bulgaria to bring workers to make sure there was food on the table later in the year. It's a little hard to say which countries are handling it better, because I think we have a situation where most countries are getting it wrong at this point in terms of maintaining a restrictive approach and in not respecting migrants' rights.
I'm really glad you broke down those distinctions, because I think people often lump everyone who's on the move together. And I spent some time living in Mexico, and there was a famous line they love to say down there, which is, "We didn't cross the border crossed us." Many people moving with the migrant seasonal work for generations before a border was even there. About the people who are leaving because they have no choice, they're fearing for their lives, how has COVID made that different, given that many countries shut down their borders?
Well, you just said it. They don't have the access that they have a right to apply for asylum or protection in other countries. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees office noted that by and large, access to countries, for example, in Europe, and that applies in the US, that applies in Africa, that applies in other regions. People are fleeing like a burning house, and the door to get out is like barred. And what do? So it's a pretty serious situation, and I think when I say what do, I think, and this is the common advice by many, is countries have to stop doing what they're doing in terms of A, building walls, B, denying people access to asylum, C, in what we've seen recently in Europe and also at the Mexico-US border, is actually people being pushed across and not even being able to get some kind of safe haven or safety, or even if it's temporary, or even if it's being put in a shelter and given at least humanitarian aid until they can be processed, and people who have, according to the UN definition, a valid claim get accepted and either resettled locally or resettled elsewhere.
The Biden administration is actively trying to change the reason people are fleeing Central America to Mexico and ultimately north to the United States by investing millions, if not billions of dollars into Central American countries. This is being led by the Vice President Kamala Harris. Do you think this is an effective mechanism?
I would suggest that's only one little piece, a very important piece in that region, and a very important piece if the investment is made in developing industry and other productive activities that are employment rich in that region, and also reinforcing the ability of the governments and the systems in those countries to provide social protection, to provide health care. But the irony, and this is what I want to underline about this whole discussion, is at the same time you have a situation where in the last several years, Germany is losing, well, let's say between 2015 and 2030, Germany has is losing 6 million people in its workforce. The Russian Federation has lost 12 million since the year 2000. China is forecast to see a decline in its workforce because of demographics by about 15% of the workforce by 2040. So you have all these barriers going up, and now you have situations where, look, because of COVID barriers and entry bars, the construction industry in Singapore basically has almost collapsed. Enterprises there are saying their projects are behind a year. The result is they try to raise the wages to offer jobs, get people on board, pushes inflation. It stops construction from producing, putting into operation factories, hospitals, whatever. And an end result is also a lower consumption and higher inflation. We see 6.2% inflation in the US at the same time that employers are saying, we cannot find the right people to fill millions of jobs. That on top of the fact that you had the so-called great resignation, I think in the month of August, when more than 4 million people left their jobs. And you have a conundrum here where we're all very worried about a few tens of thousands of people who are trying to flee across borders in irregular means, and at the same time closing the doors so that the people. Let me give you another example.
Patrick, I'm so sorry. This is such great insight. We want to have you back. We've got to end this interview, but I appreciate your insight and your perspective on this important day. Thank you so much, Patrick Taran.